"I'd like to tell you my story," said one of them so bold. "I'd like to tell you my story because I think it's getting gold. I'd like to tell you my story, but these words are not mine. These are Leonard Cohen's words. And actually, I realized that I keep telling this over and keep doing this over and over again, that I express myself using someone else's words. I'm a big Star Trek fan, and my friends at the office know me for interrupting our lunchtime conversations by saying that, and look, that reminds me about Captain Picard saying this and that in that episode. And this is actually what we've all have been doing even before the internet. That we've been using someone else's words or works to express ourselves. And what I see is happening on the internet is that this thing continues. That people are using someone else's works to express themselves, to share their experiences while reading or watching a certain work with others. They share the works. And the accompanying message or accompanying emotions or accompanying memories that they themselves had when watching the movie or reading a book. A while ago, I wrote a short science fiction story, and I realized that I actually was doing the same thing. I designed a kind of a plot, but when I was trying to put it on paper, I immediately started using texts that I know from my own education. I invoked some dialogue of Plato, and I invoked the works of Stefan Wiechecki, who is known for preserving kind of a special language we used to use in Warsaw. And I mixed it together and came up with my own story. So I told you that I want to tell you my story, but it's getting, I'm afraid that it's getting gold. And actually our story, which we are having at the Modern Poland Foundation, I also have this feeling that it's getting gold, or for some people, they might consider that it's getting something like a crap. Because, and actually one of my colleagues, Wojtek Orliński, is a good example, because he keeps reminding us that he believes that we are kind of useful fools for certain forces that would like to deprive creators of their work, of their creativity. And yes, I believe that we are always at a risk of being, all of us, of becoming useful fools, as long as we remember, we might get to be useful fools if we don't remember to not to get corrupt, and remember to get back to what we feel at our heart. So now I would like to really go back to my heart and speak from my heart to you. And what I have in my heart when being a lawyer is this idea that we should legalize non-commercial sharing. And this is the idea that we also develop in the Modern Poland Foundation. Because what is happening, what I just described, this process of using someone else's works, and what is happening a lot in the internet is this is what we call non-commercial sharing. And these are people who share someone else's works to large extent to express themselves. But copyright law stands in the line, because most often than not, when you share someone else's work, you commit copyright infringement. So we were thinking at the Modern Poland Foundation how to change it, how to use the current copyright framework to allow people to do it, while at the same time not abolishing copyright law or not depriving authors of their protection. And we've came up with an idea which is compliant to, we believe it's compliant to the international legal framework, so it can be implemented within the current regime of the Berne Convention and also of the European Union law. It consists of two important elements. First, because when you think, usually when you try to design something in copyright law, if you want to give users more space, more freedom, what you do, if you are a legislator, you craft a new exception. That's what user freedoms are called in the European Union. You craft a new exception. So, for example, we have a quotation exception, etc., etc. But the currently existing exceptions, they do not cover non-commercial sharing. To some extent, they do. So, for example, you can invoke quotation, you can invoke parody exception to cover some of the sharing of someone else's works, but obviously that's not that doesn't cover everything which is going on, which users of the internet do. So we were thinking how to design a new exception that would cover these, and this can be done partially within the current international regime, because that's possible to cover non-commercial transformative uses of copyright-protected works with a exception broader than just quotation or parody. And Canada is a very good example, because Canada has something which is called user-generated content exception. It allows natural persons to make creative transformations of copyrighted works, provided that this is done solely for non-commercial purposes. The source is mentioned, which is quite obvious because you would always want to attribute the original author. Then there are two other conditions that the Canadian law requires. That it requires that the original work can be reasonably believed to be non-infringing, and that there is no substantial adverse effect on the exploitation of the original work or the market for it, which is a kind of, which to a lawyer resembles the three-step test of the Berne Convention, which is also copied to European Union law. You cannot simply copy Canadian law or this Canadian provision to Europe, because there is, for example, some difference between these, for example, the Court of Justice of the European Union interpretation of the three-step test than the Canadian Supreme Court compared to the interpretation of the Canadian Supreme Court. So we were thinking how to make the CG EU more confident that they could, that if the EU introduces such an exception, they can live with this. And one of the ideas that we had was that to explicitly say that users that the users would be allowed to invoke this new exception that we design, provided that they only use intermediaries whose role is merely technical. So we would require users stick to this traditional peer-to-peer communications without using some higher level intermediaries, which is actually what the internet was initially about, the peer-to-peer communication, computer to computer. As a side note, I'd like to mention that we are a bit worried with what's happening on the internet, that more and more of our communications is being intermediated via exclusively owned channels, which and we think that copyright law is to some extent reason why this trend gets bigger and bigger, and that we could solve a bit of this problem by changing the copyright law and by making the non-commercial sharing more in parallel, on equal footing with other types of users. Because now when you look at the copyright law, you have safe harbor for intermediaries, but you do not have a safe harbor for users. If I run a platform, I can invoke a safe harbor and say that I'm merely hosting. If I'm a user and if I post something on the internet, even if I do it non-commercially, and Antonio was talking about this yesterday, I probably do not know copyright law. I probably do not care, but formally I'm a copyright infringer. And we'll today hear Carolina talking about the Diego case, which shows how in practice that may end up. So we are trying to design a kind of a safe harbor for a normal user here. The other part, because you obviously might ask, so what with the authors now? Because I'm quite now I was quite elaborate about users, and in the beginning I said that we want to preserve the protection of authors. So let me now get to this. Even if we manage to get the new user-generated content exception, which would cover non-commercial transformative users, so first of all, we are only halfway in legalizing all non-commercial sharing. Secondly, there is still this authors part missing. So the second part of our solution that we were thinking to that should accompany the first one is a kind of license, a general license for internet users. And so far, after analyzing all possible solutions that we have under currently under the current international copyright framework, the thing which is available and which is already used and it already predates internet is collective licensing, and namely extended collective licensing. Extended collective licensing means that you can, as a user, you can get a license for the use of certain work, or actually for a portfolio of works, without having to contact each individual author separately. You just go to a collecting society and get a contract, get a license that covers the whole portfolio, even if that's extended collective licensing, even if the author hasn't signed up to the collecting society organization. This solution is not perfect. Yes, I agree. Collecting societies do not always work smoothly. They are often not transparent, but that's the tool that we have. And we were thinking, why not use it? So the other part of our solution is to introduce an extended collecting licensing scheme that would cover sharing of original works, because a lot of this non-commercial sharing which is going in the internet is not transformative. When I share with my Facebook friends snippet of Star Trek with just some single small comment, that's barely quotation right. That's closer to sharing a part of original work, or maybe even a whole work. And if I do it publicly, I would be facing maybe even criminal, but copyright liability. This solution of ours, extending the extended collective licensing on regular internet users, would allow us to get a license, each and every one of us, for doing this. When there is a license, then there is usually a payment. So there would be a payment accompanying such a license, and the payment is the part here which would be also used to compensate the authors, and that's the part of our solution which covers the interests of authors, And this is, I think, an important part of the story that I want to tell. And this is actually something that I really would like to convince all those people who tend to perceive us as kind of copyright revolutionaries who would like to abolish copyright. No, we don't want it. We believe that this remuneration should accompany the use of copyrighted works. And it also serves a very important purpose connected to this problem that I mentioned briefly, this monopolization of information channels. We believe that if we succeed to introduce a scheme for sharing profits, for sharing money associated with the use of works, if we were able to distribute it fairly, which is, of course, a tricky, hard to do, yes, I agree, then we would help somehow to fight this problem of monopolizing the problem of which many people call the long tail of culture, and so on and so on. There are some legal obstacles or things that we have to solve when implementing the ECL. If you're interested in technical legal stuff, I can briefly tell you about it. So, for example, there was the Solier and Doak case before the ECJ, where the Court of Justice of the European Union, which analyzed the extended collective licensing schemes and mentioned, for example, that if ECL, the extended collective licensing, is introduced, authors should not be deprived of their right to individually manage their works. So, for example, the court suggested that there should be a kind of opt-out possibility for the authors from the extended collective society scheme. And there you might, if you want to torpedo our ideas, you might try to think of other problems. So I agree that this solution might not be easily implementable under the current copyright framework, that there might be some changes on the necessary on the higher level, maybe in the Berne Convention, but I'm not confident that, let me tell it the other way. I'm confident that there is much that can be done without revolutionizing the Berne or the EU law. And having said that, I'm also quite skeptical, because I don't see much of these things that I've been talking about in the current EU reform. There is a lot of other stuff going, many cases in totally opposite directions. So this makes me a bit worried. But I think that this is not work for this year or the next year. It's work for decades. I only hope that the society realizes that the sooner we start, the sooner we stop criminalizing the individual users, the better for the whole society. Because the longer that we preserve the current restrictive and actually the kind of copyright law that no one, like Antonio told yesterday, that it's too long, didn't read. If you think about the law, that it's too long, you don't want to read it, you don't respect the law. And as a lawyer, it worries me, because I would like people to feel the ideals of the law and to share them.